When Norse settlers pushed into Iceland, Greenland, and the far Arctic fringe, noise was not just inconvenience. Sound carried across frozen ground. Smoke revealed location. Heat loss meant death. What they built in response was not a louder fire or thicker walls, but a house that worked quietly, efficiently, and, well, invisibly. These homes did not roar with flames or whistle with draughts. They held warmth, killed echoes, trapped scent, and blended into the land so completely that outsiders often walked over them without realizing people lived beneath their feet. Some techniques were guarded closely, not because they were mystical, but because they gave a decisive survival edge in hostile territory. Once you understand how these Viking homes worked, modern buildings start to feel strangely wasteful and exposed. Why Arctic survival forced Vikings to rethink the idea of a house. In temperate Scandinavia, timber longhouses worked well enough. In Arctic regions, timber was scarce, winds were brutal, and winter darkness erased margin for error. A loud, drafty structure burned fuel too fast. A tall structure advertised its presence. Vikings adapted by abandoning the idea of walls as barriers and instead turning the earth itself into the structure. The result was a home that behaved less like a shelter and more like a living system, regulating heat, sound, and moisture without constant human input. How the silent Viking home used the ground as insulation and armour. The defining feature of these homes was partial burial. Floors were sunken below ground level, sometimes by several feet. Walls were built from stone and turf, stacked thick and heavy, then backfilled with earth. The roof was layered with birch bark and sod, turning it into a living surface. This mass absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. Wind could scream across the landscape without penetrating the interior. Sound died inside the walls. Even storms passed with barely a whisper indoors. Silence was not accidental. It was engineered. Why these homes needed less fire and produced less smoke. Fire was used sparingly and intelligently. Hearths were small and often offset rather than centred. Smoke vents were narrow and carefully positioned to encourage slow upward drift rather than fast draft. Because the structure retained heat so effectively, fires did not need to burn constantly. A short burn warmed the mass of the house, and that warmth lingered for hours. Less fire meant less smoke, and less smoke meant fewer visible signals and healthier lungs. In regions where driftwood was precious, this efficiency was the difference between survival and abandonment. So, sound control wasn't just about comfort. It was really a matter of survival. The earth and turf walls, well, they absorbed vibration. Footsteps outside were muted, and voices inside just didn't carry. Even the sounds of tools and movement, they were dull rather than sharp. In contested or unfamiliar territory, this was honestly crucial. Silence protected families from predators, rival groups, and even, I suppose, the psychological toll of constant environmental noise. Modern acoustics, interestingly enough, confirms what Vikings learned through experience. Dense, irregular materials kill sound better than thin, rigid surfaces. These homes were quiet because they were massive, layered, and imperfect by design. But you might wonder, why did this knowledge fade instead of evolving? Well, as climates shifted and societies centralized, above-ground timber buildings made a comeback. They were just faster to build and, frankly, easier to repair. Over time, the skills needed to balance earth, moisture, airflow and heat simply slipped away. Written records, as it turned out, favoured kings and battles, not the builders. Later cultures inherited the land, but not the methods. What remained were ruins that looked primitive to untrained eyes, really hiding sophistication behind their simplicity. The silence that once defined these homes, in a way, made them all too easy to forget. So, here's how modern builders can actually apply this technique today, without having to live underground. You really don't need to recreate a Viking sod house just to benefit from the principles behind it. Earth-sheltered walls, even if they're only partial, can dramatically cut down on heat loss. Having thermal mass close to your living spaces helps stabilize those big temperature swings we all dread. Roofs that are designed to hold insulating layers instead of just shedding them right away tend to perform much better in cold climates. And interestingly, soundproofing improves almost automatically when you prioritize mass and use irregular materials. Even modern materials can, in fact, follow this ancient logic. The aim here isn't imitation. It's understanding why the system worked in the first place. Now, let's talk about how this technique actually shifts the way we think about survival today. Most modern survival planning, honestly, is all about stockpiles. But Viking homes, they focused on reduction. Less fuel was needed, less exposure was created, less noise was produced, and less maintenance was required. The house itself did most of the work. When you look at long-term survival scenarios, this approach really scales better than those constant input systems. A silent, heat-stable shelter, in the end, outperforms generators, heaters, and all those temporary fixes once your resources start to thin out. So, why does history keep offering up solutions that modern design seems to ignore? Well, the silent Viking home wasn't exactly banned knowledge in a dramatic sense, but it was guarded, practiced only locally, and then abandoned when conditions changed. What was actually lost wasn't secrecy, but continuity. And today, as energy costs keep rising and climates grow harsher, these ideas are making a comeback. Rediscovered by builders, survivalists and historians who truly recognize their value. If this kind of deep historical survival knowledge matters to you, do subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who thinks innovation only moves forward. Sometimes the quietest solutions are the ones that last the longest.